And then after we set that up, let's also make it so that when you click the delete button for one of these, something actually happens. Okay, but let's start with auto clearing the field when you submit it. So up in our code, inside our create item function, why don't we just add a new line and say our field, right, the object that represents that element. Let's look inside it to access its value, and then let's just set its value to equal an empty string. Okay, also, if the user clicks the submit button instead of hitting enter or return on their keyboard, I think it would be cool if when they submit, if the text field got automatically selected or focused again, so that if they wanted to add another item, they wouldn't need to manually click the field again. It would just already be selected and ready for them to type. So in our code, we can also say our field dot and then call a method named focus. Okay, let's test this out and see how it works. So by carrots, it got rid of it for me and I can just keep typing. Feed cat, and even if I use the submit button, so walk dog, and I click this, it automatically selects it. Awesome. Now let's finish up our app by working on the delete functionality. So we want to respond to the event of the delete button getting clicked. Now our first instinct might be to try and use the add event listener method, right? So maybe try to select all of the delete buttons and then call add event listener, but we would run into an issue. And that is that when the app first loads or when the web page first loads, there aren't going to be any items, right? This area is going to be empty. So there would be no delete buttons. And in JavaScript, you cannot add an event listener to something that doesn't exist yet. Now there are several ways around this problem, this issue of adding events for future elements that don't exist yet, but right now I'm going to show you probably the simplest way of handling it. Why don't we do this? Down at the very bottom of our code, let's create a brand new function. So function, let's name it delete item. The name doesn't matter, that's just what I'm going with. Parentheses, curly brackets, and inside the body of this function, just as a test, let's create an alert pop-up that says delete requested. Okay, now the question is, how can we run or call or execute this function when the user clicks on one of the delete buttons? Well, in our create item function, remember this line of code where we are creating the HTML template for an item? Well, here's the HTML for the delete button. So check this out. On the opening button tag, we can just say on click equals, and then we can just give it a little bit of code to execute. So we can just say delete item, parentheses to call that function. So let's test this out. Down in our code, if I add an item, by carrots, and if I click the delete button, awesome, we see that delete requested pop-up. Okay, now we don't actually want to show a pop-up. What we really want to do is delete this list item from the list. However, imagine we have maybe several items in the list. When we click a button, we need to know which item just got clicked on, right? We need to know which list item to delete. So check this out. Within our HTML template, inside the parentheses for delete item, when we are calling it, we can just say this. Because the web browser considers each HTML element an object, well, when this function runs, what is the object that is calling it? You guessed it, it's the element. So if JavaScript considers that the object that is executing this function, that's what it's going to set the this keyword to. Awesome. So that means the element that needs to get deleted from the page is going to get passed into our function. So in these parentheses, we can create a parameter. I'm going to call it, the name doesn't matter, but I will name it element to delete. Okay, and then instead of that annoying pop-up, let's just access that element. So element to delete. Now this is going to point towards the delete button that got clicked. But we don't just want to get rid of the delete button. We want to get rid of the entire bulleted list item. So we can just say dot parent element. And that's going to select the HTML element that is housing this element. Okay, so once we've selected that, then we can just call dot remove to remove the element. All together, let's test it out. So buy carrots, walk dog, feed cat, and if I want to get rid of walk dog, let's click delete. Awesome. Now that's going to bring the hands-on portion of the lesson to a close, but let's talk about where we go from here, because there's one huge glaring problem with our app, and that is that every time the web page gets reloaded or refreshed, all of the user's items and data is going to get reset, right? If I come up to our code and even just add a couple of forward slashes to force CodePen to reload the page, all of our data is gone. Obviously, this is a big problem. So in the real world, we would need to store this data somewhere. Now, we could save it to the user's physical device using a web browser feature named local storage, but that's not ideal, because if the user switched from their phone to their laptop to their desktop to their work computer, their data is not going to follow them around. So, in the real world, the only practical solution for some sort of persistent data is to send it to a server or some computer that's, quote, in the cloud in order to save it to a database. Now, databases do not understand web page elements, meaning we can't exactly just send a bulleted list of HTML content over to a database. Instead, we want to send raw plain data, like strings of text, or objects, or arrays. So that's why we spent so much time in this chapter learning about the JavaScript language itself and working with raw data. Because as we saw in this lesson, working with the web browser is relatively easy. The challenge comes when we realize that we need to manage two completely different things. So one is the raw data, for example, right, an array of the user's items like this: buy carrots, walk dog, feed cat, right? Servers and databases want raw data like this. But raw data like this doesn't mean anything to the users that are actually using our app, right? So the other thing that we need to manage is the visual user interface. Now, managing those two different things at the same time can be very overwhelming, and this is why libraries like React and Vue.js and Angular are so incredibly popular. Now, ultimately, in the real world, I do recommend using one of those libraries. However, until you can clearly understand and describe the problem that these libraries are solving, I recommend staying away from them, because I've seen countless beginning developers suffer from the disease that is called trying to learn everything at once and getting confused and giving up. This is a disease that plagues millions of people around the planet. Now, I'm not proposing anything extreme. I'm not saying that you need to be skilled enough to create your own library before you use someone else's. I totally disagree with that line of thinking. All I'm saying is give yourself a chance to understand the bigger picture, how all of the puzzle pieces fit together, and at least understand the problem that a library is solving before using said library. Because I guarantee if you genuinely understand the need for a library and how it fits into what you're trying to achieve, it makes learning the library 500% easier. It makes it a piece of cake. Okay, but learning a particular library is not the goal of this course. Our goal is to understand the full scope, the full stack of an application. In this lesson, we saw the general idea of how JavaScript can control the web browser. So, up next, in our next chapter, we're going to dive deeper into why we need a server, or at least a third-party service, where we can send our data to. Now, a lot of people get intimidated when they hear the word server or cloud. But I can tell you right now that with the right guidance, there's nothing to be scared of. We're going to walk through the server side of things together, and it's actually surprisingly simple. So let's keep things going, because this is where our progress is just going to start skyrocketing. We understand the basics of the JavaScript language itself, and now it's time to just see how all of the different environments work together, right? We just took a look at the web browser. Up next, we're going to learn about Node, And then eventually we can learn about MongoDB and how to save our data in a database. If you can seamlessly tie these three environments together, you are a full stack developer and you are incredibly in demand. So let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next chapter.